Hello all, welcome to the video lecture. This is Ramesh Lama. Today we will be discussing about the image formation model in computer vision. As we know that computer vision is about making computers able to see, which means given a picture or image, a computer can tell us about that picture or image. So we will start our journey of computer vision with the definition of digital image and videos. A digital image is a two-dimensional function fxy where x and y are spatial coordinates, and the amplitude of f at any pair of coordinates xy is called the intensity or gray level of that image at that point. In digital image, xy and amplitude value of f are all finite discrete quantities. Pixel values are most often gray levels in the range of 0 to 255, and which we call the range of black and white, because 0 represents black and 255 represents the white. And we can represent the image as a two-dimensional array or matrix where each element of the matrix which is represented by fxy, or each element of matrix represents the pixel value ranging from 0 to 255. While talking about the different types of images, one is the intensity image, also known as monochrome image. In intensity image, each pixel corresponds to light intensity, normally represented in grayscale. And if we look at the image like this and take the small piece of it, it looks like a 2D array or matrix. An element of matrix are grayscale values which the program has to deal with. If you write a program that will look at these numbers and make sense of it and tell us whether there is a worm or bacteria or something else in the picture. And another type of image is the RGB image or color image. And in this type of image, each pixel contains a vector representing red, green and blue. We can see here each pixel has a three-dimensional vector. We can say 3D vector, and it's also same as a grayscale image. Only difference is that each color component is that each matrix represents each grayscale represents the image for corresponding color component. Another type of image is the binary image, or we call it the black and white image. Here each pixel contains one bit, and 1 represents white and 0 represents black. Here we can see a matrix with the binary data, and it is composed of only 0 and 1. And another important thing about the image is the image resolution. This image resolution tells us about how many rows and columns we have in the image. And the first image, if we look at the first image on the top left, it's composed of 256 rows and 256 columns, and second with the 128 rows, 128 columns, and third is 64 by 64, and the last one is 8 by 8. And in here it consists of only 64 pixels, 64 pixels in the right down corner, down right side of this of the slide. Well, talking about video is represented as a sequence of pictures, and each picture is treated as two-dimensional array of pixels. And typically video consists of 30 frames per second. That means in 1 second there is a flow of 30 frames. In this figure we can see 2 frames, like both of them contains the tree and people. In the frame 2, we can see the tree is moved down to the right, and people moved farther the right than the tree. Like this kind of frames, sequence of frames construct a video. Well, talking about the image formation, images are typically generated by illuminating a scene and observing the energy reflected by the objects in that scene. Here we can see the illuminating source energy, and the light from the energy source or illuminating source is reflected by the scene element, and that goes through the imaging system and projected on the image plane, and we get the digitized image. Where images are formed within the cameras, and if we look at the human visual system, they are actually formed in the retina at the back of our eye. And during the image formation process, we take three-dimensional world that we live in and we project it into the 2 dimensions. So when we have an image, a photograph or something like that, it's flat and it's only 2-dimensional, and so we have taken 3-dimensional things and transformed it to the 2-dimensional thing. We can see in the figure that at the point of observation, we look at the objects or the scene that's that's in 3-dimensional world, but when it's projected on 2D plane, or it's a 2D image, or it's flat. So what happened here is the 3-dimensional thing is transformed into the 2-dimensional things. So there are something very interesting consequences of trying to crunch 3-dimensional data down into the 2 dimension. If we look at the photographs of landscape, it looks 3-dimensional to us, even though we know it's flat, it's photograph and it's perfectly flat. So there's some magic going in our head where we are reconstructing dimensions that don't actually exist, and that just comes from our own personal experience of the 3-dimensional nature of world, and our brain fills in this extra dimension. To record 3-dimensional scene on the 2-dimensional surface, it requires some skills, some insight into the both geometry and mathematics. If we look at the sort of drawings that are done by young children or the cave paintings of our ancient ancestors, it's clear that they didn't have the required insight. The drawing that they do are very simplistic and very and they don't really capture the 3rd dimension. We can see in this figure in the left side, the image of house is perfectly drawn. We can see only the 2 dimensions, 2-dimensional information is visible. Similarly, on the right side of the image also, it doesn't capture any 3rd-dimensional information. So it took humanity quite a long time in order to come with an understanding of how to do this. So if we look at the figure, this painting, which is after all 2-dimensional, it inspires us as a viewer a very vivid 3-dimensional perception. We can see that this painting, this is a painting, the underlying geometry mathematics has been beautifully captured. We can see, like, we can find the 3-dimensional information in this figure, and in order to achieve this realism, we need to understand the underlying geometry. And in this particular drawing here, we can see a lot of geometry construction lines put in the place by artist in order to ensure that the geometry of final painting will be correct. You can see lots of dots, dotted lines, which is used to capture, or which is used to capture the 3-dimensional perspective. So before going in more detail about the image formation, let's look about the geometry of light. All images start with the light coming from the source of illumination, perhaps the sun, perhaps the indoor lights in the ceiling of the building, and that light reflects of objects in the world, as we saw in our previous slide as well. And some of the reflected lights ends up in our eyes, and there are two types of reflection basically. The one is mirror-like reflection, we call it specular reflection, and the other is reflection from diffuse or matte surface, which is called Lambert-Sayre reflection. The Lambert-Sayre diffuse model assumes that the light reflected from the rough surface is dependent only on the surface normal to the light direction, and therefore the Lambert-Sayre surface is equally bright in all directions. We can see in the right side of the figure that the reflected reflected light intensity is dependent on the cos theta I. Theta I is the angle of incidence, and this model conflicts with the observed behavior of diffuse surfaces such as in the moon, we can see here in the figure. And most surfaces are mixture of specular and Lambert-Sayre reflection. In specular reflection, the angle of incidence is equal to the reflection. I think this is a very simple model we have studied so far about the light and the reflection of light. And most surfaces are mixture of specular reflection and Lambert-Sayre reflection, but irrespective of the sort of reflection that's occurring, we have light from the light source reflecting of objects, and some of those light rays are going to enter our eyes. And once again we have observer, we have our observer of the scene, we can see here, and we have three-dimensional object in the world, and we are going to consider what happens at just a few points on that particular object. So first thing we need is a source of light. We turn on the sun, and what's going to happen now is sunlight is going to be reflected from the sunlight is going to be reflected from the object at the number of these points, and some of these light rays are going to enter the eyes of observer. And when we look at three-dimensional statue like this, either through a camera or with our own eyes, we experience a very vivid or crisp image of that object. So, but if we simply hold up a piece of paper here and it is receiving a light that's reflected off the statue, then no matter how hard or how closely we look at this paper, there is no concept of image being formed on here. So we need to organize the light rays which are leaving the statue in order to get the crisp image. So let's look at this problem graphically. We have an image plane, a piece of paper that we just held up, and if we consider any particular point on the image plane, the light that's falling on any single point could have come from the number of points on the three-dimensional object. What happened is the light from all the points is being mixed up, so that if we just hold a piece of paper, no coherent image will be formed on that. So what we need to do is to order the light rays in some way, and the simplest way to think about this is to put an opaque plane in front of the image plane and to drill a small hole in it, and this configuration is referred to as a pinhole camera. What this does is the order the rays that are leaving the points on the object, and it causes an inverted, that is an upside down image to be formed on the image plane. This approach to imaging is called the pinhole camera. Sometimes it's called the camera obscura, and it's been known since ancient times. This picture shows a building with a small hole drilled in its wall, and what's happening is that there is an image of bright sun inside bright sun outside is being cast on the interior wall of the building. We can see here in the figure, and here the rays of light leaves various points of the object. They all pass through the pinhole and cast an upside down image on what we call the image plane. The geometry of this pinhole camera is actually very simple to describe. We will consider that the object is at the distance z away from the plane of the pinhole, and the image plane at the distance f, which we call the focal distance, away from the plane of the pinhole. Then if the height of the object is y, the height of the image is small y, and there are two similar triangles, so it's very easy to write the relationship over here, like the ratio of height of the object to distance of the object from the pinhole camera to object is equal to the ratio of height of the projected image to the focal distance. It simply comes from the fact that we have got two similar triangles. We can also do the same thing for horizontal plane, and we introduce the symbol x for the distance out of the page of the object that we are looking at, x for the distance and small x for the distance along the wall in the image plane. We can again write the equation that come from looking two similar triangles. So this image formation process maps a point in the world with x, y, z to the point on the image plane whose coordinates are x and y. So we can arrange those equations in this fashion. So like we can see here, the ratio of y by z is equal to ratio of y small y by f, and the ratio of x by capital X by z is equal to ratio of small x by f, and this is what we call the projection, and it projects a three-dimensional quantity x, y, z into two-dimensional quantity x and y. It's a mapping between 3 dimensions and 2 dimension, and this is referred to as a project. This is referred to as a perspective projection. Here we can estimate x, the small x and small y from this expression, and this is the mathematical basis for the process that we would call the perspective projection. A consequence of perspective projection is that there is no unique inverse. So if I have an image of the object in the real world, then there are an infinite number of possible objects that could cause that image, and it could be a small object that's close to us, or it could be large object that's farther away from us. So what happens here is one dimension has been lost, and it's fundamental lost. So from two-dimensional image we cannot recover this 3 dimension. Now our brain use lots of tricks to try to recover that third dimension, and we know something about the structure of world, we know something about the size of objects. In this way, the 2D objects in the brain reconstruct the 3D objects. And one thing is, like, here are some example of perspective projection, and what happens here is like some parallel lines in the 3D world gets converged to a single point. We can see here in both of the picture, and these parallel lines in the world intersect in the image at the vanishing point that we call the vanishing point. And here in the figure, like the parallel line starts from point 2 and 3, and they intersect at the one that we call the vanishing point. And it's all for now about the image formation, and we will discuss in more detail about the mathematics of projection in our subsequent class.